But let's now talk about the goods and services tax. This week, we saw the government taking stock of two key disruptions to the economy, demonetisation and the GST. While the centre released the latest data on GST filings, the RBI's annual report gave out some key numbers on demonetisation. To discuss the key takeaways from both these data points, we have with us Haseeb Drabu, the Finance Minister of Jammu and Kashmir, joining us from the sidelines of the Elara Capital Conference. Mr. Drabu, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC-TV18. Let me start by talking to you about the GST collection numbers. They're ahead of government estimates, at least as far as the first month is concerned. Give me a sense of what the experience has been for a state like yours, because Jammu and Kashmir, in fact, was the last state to get onto the GST bandwagon.
Well, I think, if you recollect, we kind of moved a little slowly in the first phase because we had our own constitutional issues, and we kind of got into the actual operational part of GST a little later than the rest of the country. But for us, the experience has been very good because very surprising. In fact, I was discussing this yesterday with all the officers of the Commercial Taxes Department. We apparently are at number 3 in terms of the registration to the total collection to filing of returns in the country, which is a huge thing for us. Because there was not only a general kind of resentment against the move towards GST, but also traders were not prepared. So I think we seem to have done very well. In terms of revenues, we never had any doubts, not just nationally. I had no doubts personally about the collections that would happen. In fact, I constantly kept saying that I don't think we will need compensation from the first month itself. The GST numbers that have come in nationally are looking very good, despite all the glitches that have happened in the course of these last 2-3 months. For the state of J&K, I think we've done much better. We are still facing some issues with respect to small, very small micro enterprises who have not yet got their numbers. We are having issues in technology in terms of registration and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, we have big issues in terms of some sectors and some products like handicrafts and walnuts, where we had a zero tax regime and they are now operating at 12%. So we are going to discuss that with the GST Council to hope that we'll get them to levels which are more workable. So I think broadly, to sum it up, specific sectoral issues still remain, but the overall macro picture looks much better than we expected it to be.
Okay, so you're saying that the overall national picture for GST is better than what you expected. But let me ask you then about the GDP. The GDP print for Q1 coming in at 5.7%. One can argue that to some extent there's been an impact of demonetisation as well as the GST on account of destocking, and that perhaps has put pressure on the numbers. But the GDP only captures the formal economy. It doesn't really tell you what may be happening on the informal side. So what is your own sense about growth at this point? Do you believe that the softness that we're witnessing is likely to continue for some time?
Look, I think there is a certain amount of policy-induced slowness in the overall growth. And this is because you have shocked the system consistently. I mean, demonetization is seen one way, is a shock to the system. The transition to a new tax regime itself is a shock to the system. So I'm sure there is a certain element of what I call these disruptive policy changes, because they will take you to a next level of growth, but in the interim you would see certain slackness. I mean, in some ways, the intercept would increase, the slope which reflects growth might be a little slower. And but I think the origins of this lie in the previous budget, where there is a very concerted effort on part of the finance minister towards the formalization of the Indian economy. So you'll see a lot of informal, unorganized sector moving into formal thing, which would actually see, if not a re-rating, but some upward revision of the GDP itself, which is what I was talking about, that the intercept of that thing changes. And the slope may still remain soft, but the intercept changes, and you will see those gains. So you can loosely show, say that, okay, 20% of the black money is now, or the black economy is getting into a counted sense. But I would put it in a more generic sense that the formalization of the Indian economy started in the budget with the massive kind of incentives that were given for formalization plus GST would ensure over the next 12 to 18 months a certain revision upwards, which will have an impact both on the income distribution, growth, and even on markets like the market cap to GDP ratios will get related, you will see a certain change. So I wouldn't kind of say that this is a structural softness of growth, but policy-induced, which should go between 12 to 18 months from now. Plus, of course, with states getting more monies and spending more money, the expenditure, public expenditure-induced growth, I think will make a comeback in the next 2 years, and you will see a certain buoyancy in growth.
Okay, so expect a re-rating in 12 to 18 months. But Mr. Drabu, since we are talking about the impact of demonetization, the finance minister said that it's unfair to look at demonetization's success or failure only through the prism of the money that's returned back into the system. But one of the objects of the demonetization, according to the finance minister, was the attack on terror financing. As the finance minister of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, do you find enough evidence of that on the ground?
Well, honestly, I think I have talked about it earlier as well. It's not that as if, you know, what is cooked in the kitchen is decided in the kitchen. I mean, we are terror-infested, terror-infected, terror, you know, kind of bearing the brunt of it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the funding would originate or culminate in J&K. That would be a very, very, you know, simplistic kind of a thing to understand. Also the scales and magnitudes. I think it lies outside of J&K, the networks. So I wouldn't really see even evidence of it. I wouldn't even look for evidence of it on the ground. What you can certainly see is the pressure being built on that kind of activity, on the terror activities, in the absence of funding. So if there's some desperation on the ground that you see, where we did see for a period of 3 to 5 months, I think last year, substantial increase in bank robberies in the state and looting of ATMs and stuff, you could attribute it to the lack of funding. But I would not go to the extent of saying that, you know, there's a one-on-one causality of this. I think terror funding is a much larger issue which goes beyond the confines of the state of J&K, is not only national but international in its networks and ramifications. But we do see that the kind of terror activities that happen in the state, you could attribute some of it to the fact that there has been an impact on terror funding, and as a consequence of which you have seen activities of bank robberies or snatching of ammunitions and so on and so forth. So that's where I would try to, you know, I see it, rather than look at it in terms of, actually it's not as if in J&K you have these terror financing units located within J&K who are funding it. It's a much more global operation.
So be cautious of drawing a simplistic causality. Thanks very much, Mr. Drabu, for joining us.